So for us SQL people, we are very familiar with SQL Server in terms of on-premise solutions. We work with SQL every day. We know the ins and outs. We know how to write queries, tune, backup and restore databases, and many other aspects of SQL Server. In essence, we know local storage. Yet, this course is about Azure, and many of the modules in this course talk about unstructured data, such as blobs, tables, and queues. Now, while these components offer great functionality, they are not relational, and we want relational. And this is where SQL Azure comes in. But let's back up and take a look at the history of SQL Server. It started many years ago with the departmental server, transitioned to the local server such as SQL CE and Express, and then transitioned to the enterprise server and with its additional components such as SQL Server and integration services, SQL Server reporting services, and this really began around SQL Server 2000. However, we can really back up prior to the departmental server because many of us remember storing and tracking data in things like Excel and Lotus 123. But where do we go from the enterprise server? And really the obvious move is to the cloud. So let's talk about what SQL Azure is. SQL Azure is SQL Server in the cloud. But we need to remember that when working with on-premise, SQL Server is a machine. When you log into SQL Server, you're actually logging into a machine. However, this is not the same case when working with SQL Azure. SQL Azure is SQL Server in the cloud. You get the same functionality, including tables, relationships, store procedures, views, triggers, indexes, and all that great functionality. But when you're working with SQL Azure, you are not working with a specific machine. You're working with a TDS endpoint. This is a small paradigm shift. We need to understand that when you're working with SQL Azure, you're not logging in and working with a physical machine. You're working through a TDS endpoint to the databases that you have created. So let's take a look at this and talk about how it works. At the top of the stack, you have the applications and tool layer. This is where the developers work. They're developing the applications and using the tools to create the great applications that you and your customers work with every day. You then have the data access technology layer, where your application will use ODBC and ADO.NET to gain access to the data in your SQL Server databases. But you then have the TDS layer. This is the tabular data stream layer, which provides the communication between the client applications and SQL Server. In Azure, you then have the SQL Azure Server. This is the layer that provides the connection routing. So when you log in, where does it need to route your connection to what database does it need to route the connection to? And it also provides the billing and the provisioning. And behind all of that, you have the physical servers, which are running the SQL Server instances along with the SQL Azure Fabric. The SQL Azure Fabric is a distributed computing system composed of tightly integrated networks, servers, and storage. The SQL Azure Fabric enables automatic failover, load balancing, and automatic replication between physical servers. So instead of boring you with a bunch of other slides about how to set up your SQL Azure instance and create databases, let's open up the Windows Azure portal and do a demo there. So before we start working with SQL Azure, we first need to create our server. We've already created our subscription, so we don't need to do that, but we do need to create our server. So let's go down to the database node in our Windows Azure Management portal and click the Databases node. And here we have our list of subscriptions. We have our App Dev Cloud subscription, but we have no SQL Azure instances to work with. So to do that, we simply click the Create a New Server button, and this brings up the Create Server dialog. So the first thing we need to do is we need to select the region where our SQL Azure server should be hosted. Now, being here in Minneapolis, we're going to select the North Central US and click Next. The next screen asks us to create an administrator login and password. This is the server level principal of our SQL Azure server. So we're going to call this app dev admin. We're going to supply a password. Now, since this is SQL Server, the password must match the SQL Server password policies. So the password does follow the SQL Server password policies, meaning it at least needs to be 8 characters in length and contain at least 3 of the 4 following classes. either an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, a base 10 digit, meaning 0 through 9, or a non-alphanumeric character such as an exclamation point or a dollar sign or things like that. So 3 of those 4. So I'm going to just create a password here that's got 3 of the 4. Good to go. I'm going to click Next. The next step is the step of creating and defining a firewall rule. Now we'll talk about firewall rules in a second, but this is the first level security for SQL Azure. These firewall rules are what allow or disallow access to your SQL Azure. Now we don't have to specify at any time, so we're just going to click Finish here. Great. Our server has been created. So we can expand this, and you'll notice that here is our server, and we get a master database. But let's talk about the server name, actually. Our server name is really a fully qualified DNS name. If you look over here on the right, it's actually HTUE0D3CIN.database.windows.net. This is the server. If we're ever connecting to SQL Azure, either through an application or through SQL Server Management Studio, this is the name that we need to provide, and we'll see that shortly. So there's our server. We've created our server. We're all ready to go, and from here we can actually create more databases. So to create a database, we can actually click on Create Database, and we can give it a database name, so we're going to call this AppDev. Now notice that we have an edition and maximum size. From edition, we have a web edition and a business edition. For a web edition, we have 2 sizes. We have 1 gigabyte and 5 gigabyte database. And these are great if we're just a small mom and pop shop, or if we're doing just playing around with SQL Azure or have a small database. These will work great. We'll talk about prices in a little bit. From a business edition standpoint, we have other options. We have 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 gigabyte sizes. We'll talk about these sizes later on because you're probably thinking, hey, 50 gigabyte is not a lot, but we'll talk about some best practices later on and talk about ways from performance how to shard and scale out. We'll also talk about best practices regarding blobs and historical data and how if you're storing those in your database and moving those out, 50 gigabyte really is realistic at this point. Now, keep in mind, Microsoft is working on getting bigger databases, so 50 gigabyte is not the maximum, or it is the maximum right now, but you will see bigger databases later on. So let's just select a web 1 gigabyte edition and click OK. So there's our database. We can test connectivity by clicking the Test Connectivity button and specifying our AppDev password. Let me make sure I did that right. I'm going to click Connect, and it said, hey, I failed. Now, why did it fail? Because I did not specify this checkbox, and this checkbox is actually back on this server. So let's now talk about firewall rules for a minute. Firewall rules, as it stated, is the first layer of security that allows or disallows connections to your SQL Azure instances. So you'll notice down here the first checkbox says allow other Windows Azure services to access this server. If we want things like the portal, for example, or for a web role or worker role to gain access to our SQL Azure database, we must select this. So now that we have this selected, you'll notice that it added a Microsoft Services rule with an IP start and end range of 0. Firewall rules are IP range based. You can create a rule with the same start and end range, but they are IP address based. So now that we have this checkbox checked, we can actually test connectivity again, and we should not get that error now. Yep, success. So we can close this. Now the great thing is, you can tell that Microsoft really put some thought behind this portal, because you're asking, well, now how do I connect to this portal? And we'll talk about some connection best practices later on. But if I want to connect to, for example, the AppDev database, Microsoft gave us a leg up in this, and over on the right side of our portal gave us a section called Connection Strings. And if we click the ellipse button in there, up comes a dialog that actually gives us the connection strings that we can use to put in our application to connect to SQL Azure. So we have ADO.NET, ODBC, and as of the latest release, PHP connection string. Now you notice in the connection string, Like I said earlier, you must specify the entire database DNS name. So in this case, htu.database.windows.net, and the port, the user. The user ID must be in the format of appdevadmin @ and then server name. As far as the entire server name, you only have to specify the first part of the server name. So it must be user ID equals appdev @username and then the password. And then, as we'll talk later, you need to include the trust and connections equals false and encrypt equals true. And we'll talk about why you need to include those, or why these are included later. All right, so we've created our database. Is the SQL Azure Management Portal the only place we can create and work with databases? No. So let's minimize our SQL Azure Management Portal. Let's fire up SQL Server Management Studio. Now, notice that we're running SQL Server 2008 R2. And the reason I say that is because there's a difference if you're running SQL Server 2008 or SQL Server 2008 R2. Actually, let's go back to our portal because I want to grab. So let me copy this name. Hopefully it will allow me to copy. Yep, it did. So we're going to connect through SQL Server Management Studio. We need to provide the entire database name, and we need to set our authentication to SQL Server Authentication. This is, our username is appdevadmin. And then the password we selected. And then click OK. So hopefully you understand why we're getting this error. This is because we haven't specified a firewall rule with this IP address. So let's click OK. Let's go back to our management portal and let's add a new firewall rule. And again, Microsoft really gave us a leg up on this. You can tell that they really thought about some of these areas because they're actually telling us what the IP address is. So we can actually copy this IP address, but we do need to name each individual firewall rule. So we're going to call this just appdev. We're going to specify the same start and end IP address. Click OK. There's our firewall rule. Let's go back to our portal and let's click Connect. There we go. We have just successfully connected to our SQL Azure Cloud database. And there's our appdev database. Now, SQL Server Management Studio isn't the only tool where we can work with our SQL Azure database. Microsoft does provide another web-based product to allow us to work with our SQL Azure databases. And that we can actually get to through our Windows Azure Management Portal. So if we select our server, there's a button over here on the right toolbar called Manage. So if we select the Manage button, it actually brings up another browser. And you'll notice of the type it's bringing up, it is a Silverlight web application. And for the first time that we launch this, we do need to accept the terms of license and agree to such collection and click OK. And then it does ask us to log in. Luckily, it does provide the server name, the database name, and the login name for us. We just need to provide the password. So let's log in. And then click Connect. So what you're looking at is a web-based SQL Server Management Studio, you can call it. This is a Silverlight web application that provides basic database management facilities. You can create tables, views, and store procedures. You can run queries. You can manage database objects. And it is actually quite nice. We don't have any tables, we don't have any views, or don't have any store procedures. But if we did, we could run a query. We could open a new query. We could create a new table. For example, if we select tables, we can create a new table. And it's actually a somewhat nice web interface for working with SQL Azure. But let's log out and go back to our management portal. We don't want to save any unchanged, so we'll click this. Well, let's actually minimize that. Now let's go back to SQL Server Management Studio as well. And the reason I spoke about the differences between SQL Server 2008 and SQL Server 2008 R2 is because when you first log in to SQL Server Management Studio, let me demonstrate that. So let's fire up SQL Server Management Studio again. If you're running SQL Server 2008, not R2, then you cannot log in through this way. You must actually click cancel on this, click new query, and log in through this, and log in through the new query window. This has been fixed in SQL Server 2008 R2, so I can actually just start SQL Server Management Studio and log in this way. So there's my databases. This is SQL Server, so we can create new databases, new tables, indexes, relationships, stored procedures, things like that. I do have the security node and a management node. And let's talk about this for a minute. You'll notice that if you log into the local instance of SQL Server, let's do that. Connect to the local. Right, you'll notice that there's definitely some differences between the nodes. So I do have the databases node, I do have a security node, and I do have a management node. But you'll notice that the server object node is missing, the replication node is missing, and the agent node is missing in SQL Azure. And this really makes sense if you think about it. So let's talk about that for a minute. SQL Azure, as the whole purpose of Azure, including SQL Azure, is to let you focus on the things that you do well, and that's developing applications. You shouldn't have to worry about the hardware aspect, the operating system aspect, and things like that. Let Microsoft worry about that. And as such, you really don't have to worry about the hardware. So they've taken away the hardware aspects of Azure, the Azure platform, including SQL Azure, from you. So if you look at the nodes that are missing, such as server objects and the backup devices and linked servers, really that's really hardware specific. And since you don't have access to the drives and other servers, it makes sense that that node isn't there. From a replication standpoint, right now, SQL Azure does not support replication. And really, if you think about it, and we'll talk about this later, it makes sense that there's no replication as well. Now, there's also no SQL Server agent, meaning you can't create jobs in SQL Azure. You can't create jobs in SQL Azure. You can't do alerts and things like that. That's a bigger issue, and Microsoft is working on that. But for right now, most of the things that aren't there really make sense that they're not there because they're hardware specific. Microsoft just wants you to focus on what you do best, and that's developing applications. Okay? So let's disconnect from our local instance and focus on our SQL Azure instance. And we'll talk about the security pieces a little later, but let's talk about the databases node. I can create a new database, but for SQL Server 2008, if I right mouse click into new database, most of us SQL Server people would expect that the new database dialog would come up. But if I click this, actually all I get is what comes up is a query window with the syntax for create database. A lot of the windows that we're used to for creating databases and tables and things like that don't work right now in SQL Azure. That functionality is coming in a later release. Maybe we'll see it in SQL Server 2011, things like that. But if we wanted to create a new database, it's actually quite simple. The syntax is simply create database. We'll give it a name, so we'll call this app dev 2. And what we have to specify is the web in addition. We can actually leave it like this. And if we don't specify a web in addition, the default is simply web edition 1 GB size, if we just leave it like that. However, if we want to specify anything different, so let's say addition equals web, and we have to say max size equals, and we'll say 5 GB. Done. So if we execute this statement, command completed successfully. So if we refresh our databases, there's app dev 2, we're all ready to go. We can actually expand this now, and we can create a table. It's the same thing. If we create a table, new table, we don't get the new table dialog. We actually get a query window with the general syntax for creating a table. So for those that like to write code, you're in heaven. For those that like the Dialogues, well, you're going to have to get used to writing some code until SQL Azure supports the dialogues. You'll also notice that SQL Azure supports views, programmability, so store procedures, functions, and triggers and all that, and security. We will talk about the security aspect shortly, but this was simply a quick walkthrough on how to create a database, how to work with SQL Server Management Studio in the realms of SQL Azure, how to create databases and work with SQL Azure through the management portal.